We've been discussing the evangelical mission for transnational adoption, which has become a movement among some devout Christian families. A movement of hundreds of individual families, parents, and children in this country, each with their own individual and particular stories. So, joining my table are two people who have been involved in the transnational adoption process. Karen Moline is a mother who adopted her son Emmanuel from Vietnam in 2001 and is a board member of the Parents for Ethical Adoption Reform. And Tarikuwa Lemma, who was adopted herself at age 13 from Ethiopia and has struggled through two failed adoptions in the United States. Also with us, University of Connecticut historian Jelani Cobb. So I want to start with you, Tarikuwa. When I say failed adoption, what does that mean? What is your story?
When I was 13, my two youngest sisters and I came to America through a corrupted adoption agency. They told us that we were going to America for educational exchange program. And once we got to America, we found out that we were adopted. And we didn't even know what that meant. So our family told us that, the American family told us that they are our forever family. And I reacted with a lot of grief and anger because I didn't want a new family. I have a family in Ethiopia.
How did they respond to your reasonable grief and anger?
I think they didn't really react that well because they wanted to adopt a child who is an orphan, and the adoption agency told them false information. And it was kind of my word against the adoption agency. And plus, they just spent all this money, and they're like, we can't take you back because, like, you're our kid by law. So my sister and I just lived there for a while, and later on, I found out that they changed our names too. That's one of the reasons why the adoption failed, I think, because I was angry and I grieved over my name changed because I didn't want a new name. We already have Ethiopian given name, and then they stopped us from speaking our native languages.
And you, at this point, were 13.
Yeah. You weren't
an infant who someone changed their name. You were a young woman.
Yeah.
Your story is, Catherine, the kind of story that you tell in the book that is so hard for me to even comprehend how such a thing happens, how the set of either public policies or individual decisions allow a child who has a family, a community, even a name, to be ripped out of that around a sort of missionary notion of it being better in the United States.
Absolutely. I think what happens in a lot of cases, as in Tarikuwa's, is that there is so much emphasis and there is so much enthusiasm for adoption in the United States, and especially in this Christian adoption movement, a lot of people are very deeply moved by the idea that there are hundreds of millions of orphans in need. And so if agencies are going out there and saying, sometimes they're taking videos of children and presenting these children. Sometimes, in your case, they were giving false backstories, saying, you know, these children are destitute, these children are about to be completely orphaned, they might end up in a terrible circumstance, in prostitution or something like that. This sort of misinformation can start at the very local level, and then it comes across, you know, the ocean, and parents here, prospective parents here, are seeing that, and they're deeply moved. And they move forward with an adoption, and there have been lies and misinformation kind of seeded in from the very beginning.
So, Karen, then what is a parent, someone who does feel moved, maybe even has a sense of purpose, as is part of the language often around the evangelical part of the movement? How do you find an ethical way to be engaged in adoption?
Well, I think what you have to do first is examine your motives of going internationally, because you know what I say often is that if you're dealing with a corrupt country that has corrupt practices in every aspect of its business, why would you assume that the adoption business is exempt from the same sort of practices that taint other industries? And when you have a very emotional process, which is the need and the want to be a parent, coupled with a business model that doesn't work, you have this clash of not knowing what to do. And I think because the stories that, like we've just heard, are not isolated examples. If anything, I've learned over my years since I adopted in 2001 that the corrupt stories are more commonplace than the non-corrupt one. But it's very, very difficult for honest, ethical, well-meaning people to believe the depths of depravity that take place in this business, bringing these children to this country. And so the root of it, you know, as it says in the Bible, of all evil is money. There are staggering sums of money paid to these countries, and it's not that the money shouldn't, some shouldn't be paid for child care or for bureaucratic processing, but there is absolutely no transparency of where the funds are going. And if you're paying tens of thousands of dollars to a country, you should see something for your money. You should see orphanages that have decent care and schooling and nannies. You should see just people taking care of these children, and you don't. You have starving babies and starving children. So getting back to your question, I personally would not recommend adopting internationally now because you have no control over the process. I would recommend foster to adopt in this country. The problem is there aren't babies. There are very few young children, as Catherine said. There aren't relinquishments like there were. Most children in the foster care system in this country are older children, you know, 4 and older. I'm not sure what the actual statistic of the average age is. So, you know, when you also have a religious fervor driving your intentions, and some of the worst abuses, unfortunately, have come from faith-based agencies, and I think in part because the parishioners are not morally capable of believing that somebody who is a godly person, a prayerful, good person, is not just lying, but is stealing children, is harming innocent victims, like the one sitting right here. They cannot believe it, so they won't believe it.
Yeah, stay right here. I want to hear more from your story, and also talk a bit more about some of the ways in which it does happen in our own country across a different kind of international line, and that's the international line of the U.S. state and other questions. So when we come back, I'm sorry, it's a lot, but I do want to hear.